There is a certain kind of person who cannot be broken, not because life spared them, not because they were lucky or gifted or born into ease. You can take away their money, their reputation, their relationships, even their health, and somehow, given enough time, they come back, not the same, often stronger, as if the very forces meant to destroy them were, without their permission, building something inside them instead. Meanwhile, someone else, equally intelligent, equally capable, sometimes more talented, collapses under a fraction of that same pressure. One setback and they're finished. One rejection and the dream quietly dies. One hard year and they spend the next 10 telling the story of how it beat them, same species, same kind of pain. Two entirely different outcomes. For most of history, we've explained this gap with words like resilience, or grit, or mental toughness, vague terms that describe the effect without ever touching the cause. They tell you that the unbreakable person is unbreakable. They don't tell you why, but there is a why. It isn't mystical. It isn't a personality trait you're handed at birth like eye color. It's closer to a law, quiet, unglamorous, and almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. And the strange part is this: once you understand it, you start noticing that it was never really about toughness at all. It was about what happens on the inside, in private, in the moments no one is watching, right after everything falls apart. That's where this law lives. And that's where we're going. Picture two people standing at the exact same wreckage, same failed business, same betrayal, same diagnosis, same public humiliation. For a moment, from the outside, they look identical, both stunned, both in pain, both asking some version of why did this happen to me? But something splits them apart within days, sometimes hours. One begins quietly rebuilding a decision inside their mind, not a plan yet, just a decision, a kind of internal stance that says, this is not the end of me. The other begins building a different kind of structure entirely, a case, a story, an explanation for why they were always doomed to lose. Both are working, both are constructing something, but one is constructing a future and the other is constructing a prison, and they're using the exact same raw material to do it. This is the hinge point most people never notice, because it happens in a place with no witnesses. Nobody applauds you for the private decision to keep going before you've done anything visible yet. Nobody documents the moment a person, alone, exhausted, chooses not to accept defeat as identity. So we only ever see the results years later and call it talent or luck or toughness, when really we missed the one moment that mattered. Napoleon Hill spent decades studying men and women who had been knocked down by catastrophic failure and somehow returned stronger than before, alongside others who had every advantage and still came apart. What he found unsettled the popular idea of success completely. The unbreakable ones weren't smarter. They weren't immune to fear, doubt, exhaustion, or grief. They felt all of it, sometimes more intensely than anyone else. What separated them was a single internal habit, repeated so consistently it became almost invisible to them. They refused to let temporary defeat rewrite their definition of who they were. He gave that habit a name most people know, but almost nobody understands. He called it persistence. And before you dismiss that word as something you already know, hold on. Because what most people think persistence means and what it actually is are two very different things. And that gap is exactly why so many hard-working, well-meaning people burn themselves out chasing goals and still end up quitting, while others, doing far less visible effort, simply do not stop. Most people think persistence means gritting your teeth, forcing yourself, white-knuckling through pain with willpower alone, like clenching a fist tighter and tighter until the goal finally surrenders. It's exhausting to even imagine, and that's exactly why it fails so often, because willpower is a muscle, and muscles fatigue. If persistence were nothing but forced endurance, then the people who have it would eventually run out, the same way anyone eventually collapses from holding a heavy weight overhead. But the unbreakable ones don't run out. Some of them get harder to stop the longer the fight goes on. That alone tells you something important. Whatever is fueling them, it isn't willpower in the way we usually imagine it. Willpower burns fuel. This runs on something that seems to generate its own. So what actually powers it? Here is the quieter truth, and it's the real hidden law underneath everything else. Persistence isn't a force you apply from the outside onto a goal. It's a byproduct, an automatic result, of something deeper being firmly in place first. That something is a fixed, specific, emotionally charged definition of what you are trying to become or achieve. Hill called this definiteness of purpose, and it sounds almost too plain to be the secret to anything. But sit with it for a moment, because the mechanism underneath is not plain at all. A vague desire produces vague effort, and vague effort collapses the moment resistance appears, because there was never anything solid to defend. I want to be successful someday is not a purpose. It's a mood. It has no shape, no deadline, no specific image behind it, which means when hardship arrives and asks, is this really worth fighting for? There's no clear answer waiting. The mind, given no fixed target, quietly negotiates itself out of the fight, and it does this so smoothly you don't even notice you surrendered. You just start calling it moving on. But a specific burning purpose behaves completely differently under pressure. When someone has decided in exact and personal terms precisely what they are building and precisely why it matters to them, not a generic ambition, but something they can see, almost like a photograph in their mind, that image becomes a kind of anchor. When the storm hits, and it always hits, the anchor doesn't ask permission to hold. It just holds. The person isn't relying on willpower to force themselves through the wreckage. They're being pulled forward by a picture in their mind that refuses to let go of them. This is the actual mechanism behind unbreakable people, and it explains something that used to look like a contradiction. They often seem calmer in crisis than people with far less at stake. It isn't because they feel less. It's because the storm is happening around the anchor, not to it. Now here's where it gets more uncomfortable, because this next part is the piece almost nobody wants to hear. If persistence is the natural result of a fixed purpose, then the absence of persistence, quitting, is almost never really about the difficulty of the obstacle. It's about the purpose never having been definite enough to survive contact with difficulty in the first place. That reframes failure entirely. The person who just isn't built for this usually isn't lacking toughness. They're lacking clarity. They never fully decided. And a mind that hasn't fully decided will always, eventually, find a reason to stop, because part of it was looking for one the whole time. This is uncomfortable because it removes the excuse of, I'm just not a persistent person, and replaces it with something far more actionable and far more demanding. You haven't yet built a purpose specific enough to hold you. That's not a character flaw. It's an unfinished decision, and unfinished decisions can be finished. There's a second, quieter obstacle standing between most people and this kind of unbreakable persistence, and Hill identified it as the true enemy behind almost every collapsed ambition. Not laziness, not stupidity, not even bad luck. Fear, specifically, the fear of what other people will think if the pursuit fails publicly. This fear rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as practicality. I should probably have a backup plan. Maybe I'm being unrealistic. I don't want to embarrass myself. These sound like wisdom. Sometimes they are. But very often, underneath the reasonable language, there's a person quietly protecting their reputation instead of protecting their purpose, trading the thing they actually want for the comfort of never being seen to fail at wanting it. The unbreakable ones aren't fear-proof. They feel this exact same pull. The difference is they've made a decision ahead of time about which they value more. The approval of an audience that isn't even paying that much attention, or the completion of something they privately decided matters. Once that decision is made, really made, not just spoken, the fear doesn't vanish, but it loses its authority. It becomes noise instead of instruction. This is the internal enemy that quietly ends more dreams than any external circumstance ever does. Not the failed launch, not the rejected proposal, not the market crash, but the private, invisible calculation that happens afterward, where a person measures the pain of being seen to fail against the pain of continuing, and chooses the version of themselves that looks safer to other people. So if fixed purpose is the anchor, and freedom from approval seeking removes the drag, what actually moves someone forward through the hardest stretches? The parts where even a strong purpose gets tested to its limit. This is where another principle enters, one Hill treated as almost sacred because it operates below the level of conscious effort, what he called applied faith. Not necessarily religious faith, but a settled working conviction that sustained effort toward a clearly defined goal will eventually produce a result, even when there is no visible evidence yet that it's working. It's the difference between a farmer who plants a seed and immediately digs it back up to check on it, and one who plants it, waters it, and trusts the process happening underground that they cannot see. Most ambitions die during the underground phase, the stretch of time after the effort has begun, but before any results are visible. This phase is where doubt has maximum leverage, because there's nothing yet to point to as proof. The mind, uncomfortable with uncertainty, starts demanding evidence. Show me this is working, or I stop. And when no evidence arrives, Anshul, most people take that silence as a verdict. They interpret an unfinished process as a failed one, and they walk away in the exact season when persistence would have paid. The unbreakable ones have trained themselves to treat the underground phase differently, not as evidence of failure, but as the expected cost of anything worth building. They've internalized a fact most people never sit with long enough to absorb. Nearly everything of real value is built during a period that feels from the inside indistinguishable from failure. The tree doesn't apologize for the years it spends as a root system nobody can see. Notice how these ideas are stacking. A vague wish produces no anchor. A definite purpose produces an anchor. An anchor without freedom from fear of judgment gets pulled loose the first time someone raises an eyebrow. Freedom from judgment without faith through the invisible middle stretch collapses the moment results are slow to appear. Each piece depends on the one before it. Remove any single layer, and the whole structure becomes fragile again, which is exactly why some people apply half these principles, feel briefly inspired, and still end up quitting 6 months later, confused about what went wrong. Nothing went wrong. The structure was incomplete. Now here's the layer that changes how you see all of it. The deeper truth beneath the parts we've already covered, but Pence is often described as something you do alone, through sheer internal willpower. But Hill observed something that complicates this picture in an important way. Almost none of the unbreakable people he studied built their persistence in total isolation. Somewhere along the way, nearly all of them had contact with at least one other mind that reinforced their belief when their own belief was faltering. A mentor, a partner, a small circle, sometimes just one other person who refused to let them quit on a bad night. He called the deliberate version of this the mastermind principle. Two or more minds working in close, harmonious alignment toward a shared definite purpose, generating a kind of combined mental energy that neither person could produce alone. This matters because it corrects a dangerous misunderstanding. Unbreakable doesn't mean isolated. It doesn't mean needing no one. In fact, the opposite is often true. The strongest, most self-directed people are frequently the ones who were most deliberate about who they let speak into their belief during fragile moments, and most disciplined about protecting themselves from voices that would have talked them out of their own purpose. Persistence isn't purely internal. It's internal, protected by careful external alignment. The lone wolf myth of unbreakable success has quietly ended more good ideas than almost any external hardship because it convinced people that needing support was a form of weakness, when really unmanaged isolation is one of the fastest ways to lose your grip on a purpose under pressure, so the picture becomes more precise. It isn't willpower against the world. It's a definite purpose, protected from the fear of judgment, sustained through the invisible middle stretch by working faith, reinforced, not replaced, by carefully chosen alignment with others who share or support that same direction. Persistence, in the end, isn't really a single trait at all. It's the visible output of all these invisible parts working in coordination, which means when you see someone who appears impossible to defeat, you are not looking at one quality. You are looking at an entire internal architecture, most of which happened long before the moment that made them famous or wealthy, or simply respected by the people who watched them refuse to stop. Let's bring this out of theory and into something you can actually use, because none of this matters if it stays abstract. Somewhere in your life right now, there is a place where you have been circling instead of deciding. A goal you want but haven't defined precisely. An ambition summed into a vague hope specifically so that its failure wouldn't hurt as much if it came. That softness feels protective. It is actually the exact reason it's been so easy to consider quitting, because there was never anything hard enough, specific enough, real enough to hold you there when things got difficult. The first move, then, isn't motivation. It's precision. Take the vague version of what you want and force it into specific language. Not "I want to be financially secure," but a number, a date, a picture you could describe to a stranger in one sentence. Not "I want to write a book someday," but a working title, a page count, a date you'll have the first draft finished, however imperfect. Vagueness is comfortable because it can't be missed, but it also can't be believed in strongly enough to survive a bad month. Precision is uncomfortable because now you can fail specifically, and that exact discomfort is what gives it enough weight to become an anchor instead of a mood. The second move is identifying where fear of judgment has been quietly editing your ambitions down to a size you consider safe to admit out loud. Ask yourself honestly, is there a version of this goal I've been hiding, softening, or downgrading specifically so it would look more acceptable if I failed? That downgraded version is usually the fear talking, dressed up as humility. The real goal is often larger and more specific than the one you've been telling people, and the gap between the two is a fairly accurate measurement of how much fear has been steering you without your permission. The third move is preparing in advance for the underground phase, the stretch where effort has started but results haven't shown up yet. Decide now, before you're in it, that a lack of visible progress in the early and middle stages is not proof of failure. It's the expected texture of the process. Most people interpret this stretch as a verdict when it's actually just architecture, the unglamorous, invisible part every visible success is quietly built on top of. And the fourth move is looking honestly at who you allow near your belief when it's fragile. Not who supports you when things are easy, anyone can do that, but who you turn to or accidentally expose yourself to in the specific hours after a setback, when your purpose is at its most vulnerable to being talked out of existence. If the people closest to your fragile moments are the same people who reinforce doubt, that isn't a neutral detail. That's a structural leak in the exact place where unbreakable people are most carefully protected. None of this requires more talent than you currently have. It doesn't require a personality transplant. It requires a decision made specifically and privately about what you are actually building and why, followed by the quiet refusal, repeated daily, to let temporary defeat be mistaken for a final verdict, because that, in the end, is the entire hidden law. Not toughness, not luck, not being born different. It's this. The people who become impossible to defeat are not the ones who never fall. They're the ones who decided, before the fall ever happened, exactly what they were building, and simply never agreed, in their own mind, that a bad chapter was the same thing as the end of the book. Somewhere between who you've been and who you're capable of becoming, there's a version of you that has already made this decision, that has already stopped negotiating with defeat, already stopped asking for permission to keep going, already stopped mistaking a hard season for a final sentence. That version of you isn't waiting for better circumstances. It's waiting for the decision. The wreckage was never the end of the story for the people who couldn't be broken. It was simply the part of the story that happened right before they decided, quietly, and for good, exactly who they were going to become. The question was never whether life would knock you down. It always will. The only question that has ever mattered is what you decide, in the silence afterward, about what happens next, and whether you let that decision be the last word.